Bonjour à tous. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on statues and statutes, a roundtable on the French Caribbean in the age of #MustFall and Black Lives Matter. Let me begin by acknowledging that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chaticot, Golden Hill Pegasset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. I also acknowledge that we meet today within an institution that has benefited from the enslaved labor of African men and women. My name is Cécile Fromont, and I am on the faculty of the History of Art department at Yale, where I teach African and Latin American art history. I am here today in this capacity, but also as a member of the French Caribbean diaspora. As many of my compatriots, I was born and raised in Martinique, but left the island to pursue higher education in Europe and really never returned. First, let me say a word about the organization of our time together this afternoon or morning. I will begin by introducing our panelists and the session, and they will then share some remarks for about 10 minutes each. This will be followed by a roundtable discussion, the three of us, for 30 minutes. We will then open the floor to Q&A for the remainder of our time together. We invite you to ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom at any time. I will read the questions to the panelists and the audience once we get to the Q&A part of our time together. If you include your name and any relevant background, I will share that too. Before going any further, let me thank Professor Stephen Peaty and the Rhythm Program for offering a forum to this conversation. And thanks in particular to its Associate Director, Matthew Tanico, for making the event technically and intellectually possible. I thank also every one of you for joining us today for what we hope will be a constructive conversation. I am most grateful, of course, to Dr. Audrey Célestine and Zaka Toto for responding positively to my call to participate in this forum. So many of you gathered here today, much more than I do about the topic. But for those among us who are maybe not familiar with Martinique and its history, I have prepared the shortest of introductions about the island, focusing on the protagonist that you will hear about in the rest of the discussion. So Martinique is a small island in the Caribbean. It's about in the middle of the arc that has been French, so to speak, since 1635, with the establishment on the island of a settlement by Pierre Belin de Nambuc, this pirate-looking guy here. In 1636, as part of his plan, the first enslaved people joined the island, were brought to the island, and tensions soon rose with the indigenous populations, leading to the massacre of Caribs and Arawak Amerindians in 1658. The island would remain a sugarcane plantation colony for the following centuries, relying heavily on enslaved labor. The first abolition of slavery in the French Empire in 1794 did not reach the island, whose planter class had sided with the British at the time, in part to avoid that abolition. In 1804, Joséphine de Beauharnais, the wife of Napoleon, becomes Empress of France and a powerful spokesperson on behalf of the planters' cause. She is associated in Martinique and elsewhere in the Caribbean with the reinstitution of slavery in the French Empire. Abolition will be seized, not bestowed, on May 22nd, 1848 in Martinique by the enslaved themselves, who rose up against slavery in anticipation of the too long awaited decree from the French Assembly that had declared emancipation weeks before. A decree closely associated with French politician and abolitionist Victor Schoelcher. In 1946, in the aftermath of World War II, and under the leadership of Aimé Césaire, deputy and mayor of Fort-de-France, the capital of Martinique, from 1945 to 2001, Martinique became, alongside a small number of French so-called old colonies, a department of French. It joined the sovereignty of the French state in full form. That meant that it was no longer a colony, and thus it gains its current statutes. As a teenager, I remember asking Césaire, why departmentalization and not independence? With a look that I now, with the benefit of age, recognize as annoyed benevolence, his side stared at me and answered, ask your grandparents, that's what they wanted. Notably, as part of a large project of urban renewal for Fort-de-France, Césaire chose not to remove the statues of Joséphine, Schoelcher, or Denambuc, but to move them to less prominent locations where they received rounds after rounds of vernacular interventions, defacing, spray painting, etc. Joséphine famously lost her head in 1991 and has since been the site of street art and militant intervention. She's often seen, or she was often seen, doused in red blood, on the right with a gilet jaune, etc. In recent decades, the political has been marked by increased technicization of political debate and a relative inability of local political forces to propose a political project in a context of demographic decline, high unemployment, increasing inequalities, and the health scandal surrounding the poisoning of the island with chlordécone, an insecticide used in banana agriculture, which was forbidden because of its toxicity in all of France and the European Union, except in the French Caribbean by special derogation granted to the planters' lobby. In the summer of 2020, as the city of Fort-de-France had already decided to remove increasingly contested monuments, militants associated by all accounts with the Rouge Vert Noir movement, named after the independence movement flag, Schoelcher, Joséphine, and Denambuc. The dramatic gestures spurred an impassioned debate in Martinique, and today it is the stakes and significance of these gestures and of their interpretation that will be the topic of our roundtable. Without further ado, let me introduce to you the two panelists before we hear from them. First, I'm delighted to introduce to you Audrey Célestine, who is a social scientist and an associate in studies at the University of Lille in the north of France. Her work focuses on migration, memory, race, and identity in France, in the French Caribbean, and the United States. Her first book, La Fabrique des Identités, deals with the collective tragedy of Puerto Ricans in New York and French Caribbeans in Paris since the mid-20th century. It was published in 2018 by Cartella. She also published Une famille française, des Antilles à Dunkerque en passant par l'Algérie in 2018, on the impact of migration, exile, colonization, race, and identity in the individual trajectories of 4 generations of an ordinary French family. She also recently published Des vies de combat, Femmes, Noires et Livres in 2020. Our second panelist is Zaka Toto, who is, in his own words, a writer and entrepreneur, alternatively or at the same time. Depends, he says. Based in Martinique, he created the online review Zist in 2018 with writers, scholars, photographers, creators from across the Black diaspora, with most of the funding coming from his dad's garden. He writes about Martinique and the Caribbean, mostly, and the current global zeitgeist. He's obsessed with cities, how you walk and live in them, how the experience of a specific place relates to culture, policy, and socioeconomics. This obsession came to form in 2017 when he started a comparative writing project around colonial ideologies and legacies, how they translate into urban spaces, and the cultural dynamics involved in different cases. Linking the protest in Charlottesville to what happened in Martinique in an earlier era, but also Algeria, Paraguay, China, and Taiwan. Finally, this year, he concluded the series in the series that the most colonial place of all is Paris. He also made the mistake, he says, of starting a PhD in history at the University des Antilles on political cultures and identity in Martinique. He's also foolish enough, he says, to think that he can start urban renovation programs in Fort-de-France and build one of Edouard Glissant's old dreams. So let's now hear from our two panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Cécile, for the invitation and the opportunity to have a discussion with you and with Zaka. We've been talking a lot about these topics in the last year, and even more so during the last 6 months, but I'm happy to have this new arena to talk about all of these issues. And I think the summary, the synthesis that you provided at the beginning of your talk as an introduction was is actually very important, because we can definitely see the events of this summer, there are no summer in Martinique, but well, summer 2020 as a sort of Martinican version of a more global phenomenon. But I actually think it's really important to place it into the very localized perspective and to put it within the framework of politics and society in Martinique since the departmentalization of 1946. As you said, in 1946, representatives from Martinique, Guadeloupe, but also French Guiana and the Réunion Islands opted for and asked for departmentalization and as a full incorporation into the French Republic. And even if the choice can be, and the fact that they lobbied for that they did a proposition de loi going to that in that direction, was then considered to be sort of a misguided and a wrong decision. When contextualized, it was actually a pretty pragmatic choice, and that's how they've been defending it. And above all, it's important to consider it, and it's something that local historians have been showing as the result of a long struggle for equality, driven by a number of calculations and a strong sense of history since the abolition of slavery in 1848. And basically, this moment of departmentalization was considered to be a sort of promise of overturning the colonial relationship between metropolitan France and its old colonies and the vieille colonie. And it was seen as an important moment in that, as an important moment for completing equality, for repairing emancipation's failures. And if there was a true belief at the time that departmentalization would be this sort of would allow for true equality with all French citizens within the framework of the French Republic, political practices at the time, the forms of exercising power on parts of high civil servants, the préfet locally, the very partial extension of social and economic rights, the strong repression of political movements. All of this fed the very strong criticism of the departmentalization process. And just a few years after it was voted, it was actually considered by many as a failure and a set of lies on part of the French Republic to actually grant a real equality and emancipation. And this criticism, the wide array of criticisms against the departmentalization process, became a very important fault line in local politics. It fed nationalism, it fed the desire for independence or political autonomy, or a wide array of political imagination regarding what to make of these territories. It guided many people in the militant and political sphere in the way they would think about a true political, social, and cultural emancipation. And actually, Zaka could talk about it, about true economic emancipation as well. People, because of the false promises of departmentalization, started to think about all of that created stuff, failed, succeeded in some extent, and all of that history. And really, there's a lot of work that remains to be done on all of these political, social, cultural experiences. Zaka's work is probably, I mean, it's clearly part of this effort that we can see nowadays in scholarship to fill the gaps of the contemporary history of Martinique. I'm thinking about the work of Valériane Edmond-Mariette as well, who's a young PhD candidate in history in Martinique as well. But all of these moments that still need to be scholarly documented are key to understand the way a number of people viewed the events of 2020 around commemoration, around the statues, etc., etc. And I think it was very important. So what happened exactly? You mentioned it. On May 22nd, 2020, it was a day of commemoration of the insurrection of the slaves in 1848, and it's a year of the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. And we learned, I was in Paris, where I've been living for 22 years, just like you, I left after the baccalaureate, even if I try to go back often, and I work on the Martinican polity and society. But we learned the destruction of 2 statues of Victor Schoelcher in Martinique. Most people didn't cry over these 2 statues, and a lot of people didn't totally care, but a lot of them didn't quite understand what was going on. And at that moment, I wondered, I was like, it's May 22nd. They're not supposed to have like construction work on that day. It's a, it's a bank day. And I did not totally understand what was going on at first. The day had been marked by lots of commemorations in several places that had been transformed into places of memory, such as a Clément dwelling. Lots of strong events actually happened that day. And then there was that. A few days after, actually more than a month after that, the statue of Ernest Desproges was also unbolted. He was a politician at the end of the 19th century. He belonged to the social group of the Mulâtres, became a representative. He was the president of the General Council of Martinique. Most people in Martinique have no idea who he is exactly. Ernest Desproges is the name of a street in Martinique, and people don't really know much about him. There was no direct claim or real debate on the figure of the man, who was not totally well known and people didn't really know what to make of that event. And then at the end of July, the statues of Denambuc and Joséphine de Beauharnais were also destroyed by the same group, apparently. In that case, as you said, in the case of Joséphine, her status had already been the site of various degradations of her history, and the most important one being that she had been beheaded at the beginning of the 90s, which was a very impressive mark. I remember it when I was little, probably at the time when we met at the beginning of the 90s, and it was actually a very powerful thing to see, to walk by these statues without a head and with all kinds of degradations and transformations over time. And so even though people would not cry over this colonial, there was no colonial nostalgia on the part of any Martinican regarding all of these symbols. There was some level of misunderstanding, but also of understanding that the situation in Martinique is generally pretty bad in terms of unemployment, in terms of the sanitary crisis and the health crisis and the scandal over chlordécone. And so people have lots of reasons. It's something that we were discussing when preparing this session. There are like 1,000 reasons to burn down a lot in Martinique today at the contemporary era. These specific actions were not totally understood because precisely of this history of interventions of people from Martinique on their own urban setting. I think that Zaka is going to talk about that. And in the media comments regarding these events, you had, I mean, the destructions were attributed to several generic actors, the revolted youth, the activists of the Rouge Vert Noir movement, the people of Martinique. Le peuple, the people, is also a category that's been often mobilized. And it was interesting to kind of try and understand who was behind these events, but to understand that behind this event you had both some militants that were known in Martinique as, because they are really young, intervene a lot on social media, and are presenting themselves as anti-chlordécone activists. So there was this connection that was established between them and the anti-chlordécone movement. There was some connections as well with the notion of reparation in the public sphere, but there was clearly an indication of a general problem regarding the issue of reparation, the issue of the health scandal of chlordécone, without really understanding whether the repertoire of action was totally accurate, or whether this was, I mean, there was a difficulty to understand the whole thing. What was interesting was the reactions to the event. From the outset, a number of politicians condemned the destruction of the statues of Victor Schoelcher, and the mayor's reaction the mayor for the France reaction was basically to speed up the setting up of a commission that he had already planned on having on memory and transmission, and in which, for full disclosure, I was asked to sit in. Zaka is also part of the commission. The commission brings together academics, professors, associative activists, and a wide array of persons of several generations to offer space for discussion on these issues, with the idea of setting up short, medium, and long-term actions regarding these questions. One of the very immediate action that was organized was the setting up of a Cénacle, which was a sort of public arena in which the public and people, and including some of the people within the movement that was claiming the unbolting of the statues, to discuss in the open air in July in Fort-de-France, to debate on the issues of statues in the public space. And as I was telling you guys yesterday, it was very interesting and impressive to see how almost immediately while the events were unfolding, like this capacity to actually discuss about them, to talk about all of the problems, issues, contradictions, having old politicians, younger activists actually exchanging on the issue and being able to have like a sort of reflexive notion on this, each defending his way to do politics and each defending his way to look at the event and reflecting on recent history and longer history. It was a very interesting and important moment that, to me, has to be placed within the long series of experiences formulated by people in Martinique since the departmentalization, to try and think about ways to emancipate themselves. What's interesting is, as you said in your introduction, one of the issues, and I think that I'm almost reached my 10 minutes. I think that one of the interesting issues is that we have all of that in Martinique, people able to think about things, people who have been imagining futures and emancipated futures for Martinique. And at the same time, this sort of high technicization of political issues that to me constitute part of the problems in Martinique, that we are discussing whether this article of the Constitution is better than this other one article of the Constitution, without having political actors able to formulate at a broader level a sort of political project that people can all embrace. And I'm sorry, I concluded like really rapidly, but I'll let Zaka continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zaka, let's hear from you.
Hello, everyone. How do I share my screen? I did a small presentation, basically just pictures. How do I activate the, oh yeah, share screen, here you go. Up. This one, share. Can you see the picture? It's fine? Okay. So I prepared something. So hi, my name is Zaka. Thank you for the introduction. Sorry. First of all, I would like to be clear about who's talking, because often in this kind of talks about when we have experts and historians and people to write about subjects, we tend to put in one category people who act and people who think. I think it's very troubling. It's very troubling in the Black perspective, because I don't think at some point in history there was a difference between a Black activist and Black intellectuals. This is in pretty much all parts of the diaspora something that is very linked. And I believe that in my case, it's also kind of a dichotomy or alliance or, I don't know, or problem. I would like also to add that I really don't care about the violent fate of the statue. I mean, there were colonial relics, and they did not fit with my ideology. I identify myself as an independentist, basically since I was born. I was born in this fight. For me, Schoelcher or whatever are historical figures. They can be important in some, or related to my history, but I don't feel like they belong more than people coming from actually like the enslaved fights. Violence can be legitimate, but I'd rather say violence can be pertinent. And to further the fight, I'm 36, so I feel like I'm still a bit young, and I don't want to do what was done before me. And so for that, if at some point I say, hey, I want to, how do I further the fight? Then for me, what I study is kind of a benchmark. What was done before me and what I can do after that. And we have the resources to actually think about that. So that's why I wrote a little presentation called MustFall. Already happened, never truly ends, and then what? I'm going to be provocative, but it's interesting to go across the diaspora. It's interesting to go deep into our history and see what was done, how it echoes across communities in the diaspora, and some of the lessons also that can be learned from some of those experiences. So of course, I believe most of the American audience and pretty much all of the audience have heard about the Charlottesville protest in 2017, August, where basically there was a right-wing protest to protect a statue of General Lee. I think that's the statue of General Lee, who was basically the general leading the army to maintain the institution of slavery, if I use their language. The language of the Confederacy. And there was a counter-protest, and a young woman died. I forgot her name, I'm sorry. And this sparked a global conversation about the issue of colonial legacy. It's very, very pregnant in the US, but it's pregnant pretty much anywhere where there was an empire and there were colonies. I think it's everywhere, Asia, Africa, and Europe itself, because Europe celebrates its own, conquerors, admirals, merchants, heroes, pirates. And at that time, in August, that sparked something in me, because when I was a kid, so 1991, I was 7 years old, And I knew some of the people. This is another, I think this is the Arlington Memorial in Virginia as well, with the mammy crying for the Confederacy soldier. And this happened. So 1991, the statue of Josephine was beheaded, and blood was poured on it. And those guys were my heroes, because basically in the 80s, where it was the height and the peak of the last really violent fights in the Caribbean, in Guadeloupe, in Martinique, and in French Guyana. It was basically almost the last wave of Caribbean independence, which was not fruitful. And there was bombings and fights and militancy, and people were hiding weapons, and it was happening everywhere. There was bombing in Paris, there was bombing in Martinique and Guadeloupe, like almost like 10, 20 times a year. And that was very serious. Of course, it didn't pan out. It was not successful. And what happened was some of the militants, at least some of the cells that were in Martinique, decided to go and see the statue of Joséphine. So the Empress Joséphine of France was married to Napoléon, and beheaded and pour blood on it. And this statue is a paradox, because at the same time, you're saying that, it's over, this kind of heritage, this colonial heritage. Because this statue was basically erected in I think mid-19th century to celebrate the union between the French Empire, I think it was the Second Empire at the time, and between France and Martinique, and how this bond was materialized by Joséphine, who was born a white planter in Martinique, but married to a French emperor. So how that bond was there forever. This statue was located in the center of Fort-de-France, so the main city, and at the center of the savannah, which is, the basically Central Park. It's actually, those two places have the same function and history in the new cities of the New World. And to behead it was a way to say, this thing and the way it was established and the way it was symbolized is over. But at the same time, it was also a symbolic act, because the military action and the violent action and the political action was not successful. So it's a symbolic win, but in concrete, maybe it is not, a win. And it kind of reflects very well what happened in Martinique. So I will go back a little bit, and we will talk about the history of Fort-de-France, which was basically a colonial city, and the seat of power of all the colonial powers, of all the elements of colonial power in Martinique, as in the French government when it was a colony, and still a little bit, of the white planters called les Béquets, of the former free slave or free of colors, or the people who became wealthy after the abolition and basically were kind of pro-France and pro-assimilation, and how this got twisted basically after World War II, thanks to two things. First, there was people coming from the countryside who moved massively to the city. So that changed the demographics of the city. People who were voting were not, assimilating themselves as the winners of colonization. They were the former forced laborers, exploited labor, and basically they could finally express some political power. And, meeting with multiple generation of intellectuals and writers, so Aimé Césaire, Suzanne Roussy, René Ménil, were ferociously anti-colonialist, and am I too long already? No. And basically made a political offer to take the reins of the capital and transform it. And this is what happened, because so the movement was called La Négritude. They were claiming themselves to be cannibals, and they actually eat a lot of the political power, a lot of those colonial legacy from the inside and from the outside. They change the function of some places. So here, for example, on this picture, you have this gate. I think in English it's called Porte du Tri-Centenaire in French, and Tri-Centenarium Gate. I think Tri-Centenarium. Oh, okay, good translation. Which was erected in 1935 because, as Cécile mentioned earlier, the colony of Martinique was established in 1635. So it was to celebrate 300 years of the empire and 300 years of where the empire started. 1 minute? Okay. And basically what happened is that Césaire, who was mayor for 50 years, transformed this gate, not by toppling it, not by destroying it, but by changing what was inside. What was inside was basically a center for cultural actions that was to celebrate Black arts, bring in the diasporas, teach people culture, art, and all kinds of things. And actually, a lot of very prestigious things were done there. I cannot go into details, sadly. I only have 1 minute. And there was just, you can see at the basement, one modification that was made. There was a fresco that was done in the 80s, early 80s by an artist called Coco. And basically that celebrates the insurrection of the Caribbeans. So there was this also symbolic reversal of what this gate meant. So change of function, so that's a political action, a real concrete action. And then like a symbolic transformation of the place. Just for conclusion, I will not have the time to go through Algeria and what happened to the Stroessner statue in Paraguay. Basically, you keep some of those symbols as reminders of what happened before, rather than erase them as if they will never come back again. Because in democracy or in culture or in human societies, things tend to come back. And I choose this last symbol, which is a boulevard in the US called Martin Luther King Boulevard. And I remember when I was 20 years old, I was reading this comic called The Boondocks. And one of the characters of these comics was pointing out that some of the most dangerous places and avenues in the United States are places called Martin Luther King Boulevard. And when I was a teenager, in the small city, I'm from the countryside of Martinique, there was this place named after a very famous journalist and syndicalist in Martinique called Rue André Aliquer. And this place turned out, with the people from my age, people I went to school with, and then the younger people after me, was basically a dope selling area. And I remember there was at some points military was sent to clean that street. But the name was there, the change of names were there, the symbols were changed, but the concrete, what was happening at that time in that city, despite the nice name of the street and the fact that we reminisce of our own Black history and of our fights and of everything, it was not good. It was not good. And I think that it's very interesting to understand that, and that MustFall is not the end.
Thank you very much, Zaka. So I think we can come together now for a little bit of a panel discussion. But before we start, I would like to invite members of the audience to feel free to send their questions starting now in the Q&A function. As we continue to discuss, and we will get to them very soon. So thank you for doing that, and we are definitely recording them for to get to them later. I was really struck by the ways in which we are dealing with a very dense terrain in terms of contemporary history in Martinique. That's something that Audrey, you mentioned in the sphere of political action, and Zaka also relating it with the urban space. the urban space and the ways in which it's been resignified over time. And so a question I had for you, something I would like us to discuss, is the ways in which the many layers of political actions and monumental marking of space have been not always meeting with each other in, say, decades since the departmentalization. And so what do you think has been the challenges in this regard that have been met, and the challenges that have not been met in a way that led to the summer of 2020?
Well, maybe I can start. I really think that what you're referring to is basically one of the very important issues for people who work on public policies of memory, on memory from a very, I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to talk about my field, but really this notion that you cannot say that in the case of Martinique, decisions by political leaders, decisions by the French state is just going to be imposed upon the population and that's it. A public policy, I mean, memory works and public commemorations work if they're appropriated by people. Otherwise, you can say plus jamais ça, or you can say all kind of things, and it's gonna come back. And what's interesting is that the example that was given by Zaka about the Tri-Centennial, it's difficult, Tri-Centennial Gate, is basically, it's interesting because it's on two levels. It's the signs of kind of failed memory or commemorations policies. First, nobody knew that this place was called the Tri-Centennial Gate. Apart from Dakar, Valériane, a few historians from Martinique, and some historians said that they actually walked around the city to find it. There was no, I mean, it has not been remembered as a colonial gate. It is the entrance of the Cermak. So to that extent, it's a success on part of Césaire. It's a place where the carnival stops every year. Some groups stop there and you have like the final rounds of drums before it's time to go to a party. For others, it's a place where people just pee, in public, and it smells really bad. I mean, it's a place that has all kind of functions. Nobody remember that it was erected for the tricentennial of the colonization of Martinique. Then the work of reappropriation is known by a little more people, because people are more the contemporary of the reappropriation by Coco René Corail, that was mentioned by Dakar. More people were there, more people witnessed it. So, but clearly there's something that is lacking. The people who wanted to destroy the gate or were contesting this colonial symbol had no idea of this work of reappropriation. And if this work of reappropriation was not fully understood, it means that in terms of transmission, the transmission of our own past, there is something that is missing. And finally, during the commission that we attended, and it's something that we both noticed, some social workers who attend the commission on memory and transmission said, this is a place for people who are homeless. A lot of them are crack addicts in Fort-de-France. So, and that is another of our collective failures and another of the structural problem that exists in Martinique. The fact that the economic problem, the fact that we do have a number of social and economic problems that are seen, are visible in the city, are part of it. But I really think that all of these layers need to be addressed. And as I agree 100% with Dakar when he says, the work has been done. The work has been done on, memory, symbols, and we can do more. That's true. But the core of the action today might not be exactly there. That sparks more discussions on, okay, but what to do exactly? But I'll let Dakar respond.
So you hit the baby. No, you're absolutely right. There's this weird paradox. There's so many examples. You know, there was 2 statues of Schoelcher that were destroyed in Martinique. The one in Fort-de-France was absolutely paternalistic, and you know, once you realize what it means, it's basically a statue of Schoelcher leading a young kid. I think it's a young kid, and breaking with his feet the shackles of slavery. And obviously, in terms of the history of it, in terms of what it wanted to transmit about who did what for the abolition, the statue in itself was an insult, and could be destroyed or taken care of or put somewhere else, but not, you know, in the center of Fort-de-France, or you know, unexplained. But there was another one in another city, which actually is named after Schoelcher, and there's just a plain statue of Schoelcher, who can be criticized for many things, but mostly was a man ahead of his time at the moment, as a white guy who laid foot once in Martinique. I mean, yeah. And so in terms of those politics of memory, just behind the statue in the city of Schoelcher, there was a statue of Schoelcher with just him. So nothing paternalistic, just, you know, honoring the guy. And behind it, there's also a huge fresco made also by another very famous artist, also very engaged artist, who's a friend of Coco also as well. Same movement, same generation of local artists. And who's also, I think this one is celebrating a slave insurrection. And the fresco is much bigger and larger and has more colors than the statue of Schoelcher. I doubt that some of the people, some of the militants who destroyed the statue of Schoelcher actually paid attention to this fresco that was behind the small statue. I don't think they paid attention to it. But somehow at the same time, maybe they revealed it. So those are very much paradox. And those things were done 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So like once this conversation started this year, you're like, there's this discourse that nothing has been done. We're the first to notice the problem. There's this talk about there is no memorial for you know, maroons and resistance coming from the enslaved. There's actually, I think, 22 monuments in Martinique, almost in every city, celebrating maroons and freedom fighters, basically. You have them, you know, in roundabouts. You have them. There's a huge monuments in Djamma with like stone statues that remembers a little bit what was on the Eastern Island, you know, facing the ocean to celebrate all the people who died, you know, in the Middle Passage. There's so many strong and powerful celebrations of this history. And somehow, because there is this political void, we want to fill it with politics of memory, as if more and more and more memory will somehow solve all the political problems happening in the islands. And I think that's where there is a disconnect to me.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it really strikes me that the issue of transmission is really at the core of what is happening. That there has been movements, there has been initiatives of, you know, memorialization and monuments that have been built, and political activism that has happened in the relatively recent past. That are either not remembered or are disavowed, perhaps, by a new generation of activists whose claims seem to be to some extent similar but whose means and modes of action are quite different from older generations. What is your thoughts on that? Is that part of the issue, part of what's happening?
No, it's funny because about 2 weeks after the toppling of the statues of Schoelcher, I was turning 40. So I was like, okay, maybe it's just I'm getting old and I'm just like becoming like super reactionary. I'm like, oh, what are these young people doing? That was really, I was like, okay, that's what's happening now. And then I talked to younger people who are like, well, we don't really get it totally. So I was like, okay, maybe I'm not that old, or maybe it's not just a generational thing. But more seriously, I think that it puts us in a very difficult position. First, because I live 8,000 kilometers from Martinique. So it's actually not easy for me to, even if I'm a scholar, I'm also a Martinican, and I felt lots of passion about what was going on in Martinique, but still, I'm not living there anymore. And that's part of the equation, and that's important. But I work on the migration and on the fact that a lot of people have had to go away and not come back. It's not just a matter of my will to be exploring the world. It's also the fact that it would have been difficult for me to have my career if I was to go back. And so my individual history is part of a more structural history that is totally key to understand what's going on today in Martinique. That is that we have a very big demographic problem. That is that we experienced several decades of organized migration with a construction of a problem of overpopulation on the island. That was also a way to counter the insurrection. I mean, I'm going through 30 years of history very rapidly, but that's all part of it. And so I consider that, well, I have a say on what's going on there because I'm also the result of that history. And the thing is, it is very difficult to be addressing the actions of young people who mobilize in a country where it's actually hard to be a young person, in a country where the unemployment levels for the youth is very high, where there's an almost certainty that for all of the people involved, and probably you guys and me who grew up in Martinique, that we have chlordecone in our systems, that we all know women with endometriosis in Martinique, that we all know men with who died of prostatic cancers, and that we are all, in a way, I mean, we have that in all of our families. So that's a very important issue, and that to have young people who just like break stuff because it's an unbearable situation is of course something that is understandable. But the fact, I think it's also important to relate it first. Our history is largely conditioned by slavery, but it's also 170 years of stuff that we've been doing since then. All of this stuff conditioned by slavery, but 170 years of struggles, of victories, of failures, and I think that it's important. I work on the Bumidum right now. You have lots of master theses, articles, people who did stuff on the Bumidum. There is not one monography, academic monography on the Bumidum right now. Lots of archives haven't been open. You have like lots of gaps in our history, despite the strong efforts of local historians who are really like the driving force behind, and sometimes independent scholars, the driving force behind, unveiling very important and key aspects of our history. And there's the political class that at the same time is pretty competent on a lot of very technical issues, but is kind of unable to just propose, that has been kind of tucked in like this sort of like highly technical discussion about decentralization without really being able to think about a plan for Martinique in 2030, 2040, 2050, considering the challenges that we have. And at the same time, we've, a very weird and complex political party structure in our country with the failure and the collapse of the nationalist movement that were also sites of political training, places where you learn stuff. When you were in a political movement and a nationalist movement and you were driving for independence, you had to read stuff, you had to be trained to do stuff. And these places were sites of transmission as well. Just like the Cermak that was mentioned, the place that is supposed to be the entrance of the Cermak. It's not the entrance of the Cermak anymore. The cultural services of the city of Paris. During years, that was a place where people would learn stuff and get politicized. And we realized that these places in our societies have collapsed, have disappeared. Zaka, who is like obsessed with urban stuff and urban settings, can talk about that, but where are those places? And probably there is a generational thing. Either you are born in a very militant family and you know stuff, or you are from my generation and you went to Cermak and you know stuff. But for a number of people, they're just like, okay, I want to know stuff. So they just follow weird YouTube channels that say, total nonsense, but have 90,000 followers because people need to know more about their history. And it's these gaps that we are willing to fill. And I think it's key, it's actually important. I've been going all over the place, sorry. Go ahead.
No, just to further your point, there's something really strange that happened. So recently I was thinking about growing pains. When you grow up and then suddenly you lose some eyesight or growing pains, and in the sense of MustFall, I think in Martinique we are after MustFall for like decades now, and it's almost like a future of what happened when you are not independent, formally, but you do have some political autonomy, you do have some control of your destiny, and you have achieved some progress and emancipation, some. But there's nothing, you don't know how to formulate the next step, because there's maybe no discourse, there is no treatise about it. You're just making stuff up as you go. And this idea of having both, the political action or what we see is the progress that we want or that we can achieve at a specific time, and the ability to produce the ideas and the ambitions and the visions that can help you maybe imagine this next step. In the last 2 years, there was, and I think we were very good at it. And I think that's one of the reasons why Martinique is a very specific place. I'm sorry, I'm a homer, but we were very good at it. We have been very good at it, at having both this action, this political action that happened after the abolition of slavery, and like, how do you encroach on political power step by step, sometimes by fight, sometimes by political action, sometimes by militancy, sometimes but there was always a discourse with it that was going along with it. There was always ideas that were produced that were going along with it, that were basically stating, okay, we've done this, we need to do this next. And somehow, maybe because a generation disappeared, maybe because the fabric of society itself has changed, even though, in the last 50 years or so, there was, this Bermuda migration, things have accelerated in the last 20 years. And the way society was shaped at that time, I talked about how all those people coming from the countryside came to the city. What happened at that time was what happens oftentimes when you have very different people, all those energies gathering in a city. It's paradoxical, but it's almost as if this concentration of all the different parts of Martinique in cities that happened, after the eruption of the Napoléon and then after World War II, were also kind of the source of all those ideas and of all those, and because people were living together and they were arguing with each other, they were arguing next to each other. And by this development that we have known, all those like socioeconomics, some of the socioeconomic progress that have been made, maybe the ability to travel more, maybe, and the fact that people are living further away from each other. So this fabric of society has changed. And at the same time, all the tools that were created to foster, this living together have collapsed. and there's nothing to replace them. You know, so when I came back, so I've been reading a lot because, you know, I come from people who were in the fight. So you have to read very early on. You have to be sensitive to some of the issues. You have to be knowledgeable about them. You need to read more. That's almost like you're trained. But I realized when I was like 18 years old that most of the knowledge that I was reading were in libraries, where, you know, so you have to go to this place or this place, but they were not readily available. There was nothing on Wikipedia, for example, to put it simply. There was no program that was made to make all those things that was knowledge that was already constituted by previous generation. There was no effort at the time to make it accessible. And this problem stayed with us in the last 20 years or so. And maybe it was an occasion because, you know, you don't have maybe to have a cultural center because, you know, times change. But maybe you could have thought about something that could be done, for example, on the internet and everything. And what happened the last few years is just, you know, people trying to invest this space and they just grapple at ideas as they come. And this produce maybe something that we do not understand or find to be illegitimate.
Thank you, Zaka. I want to bring into the conversation a question that we got through the Q&A function that is coming from Elodie Eugénie. And she says, thank you for this rich discussion. You showed that this is a complex situation and that we lack an overall point of view, perspective, and sometimes knowledge of won battles with the ideas that on est les premiers à faire ça, ça n'a pas été fait avant nous. I think she's referring back to some of the discourse of the Rouge Vert Noir movement. So the question she asked is, how could you people deal with some ego maybe, but moreover, the fact that bringing context and nuances comes with the label of struck by Stockholm Syndrome. I think what she is referring to is the tensions that exist at the level of discourse and dialogue in terms of you know, having a productive conversation within that context of the post-summer of 2020.
I think it's actually, it's a key question, it's a key issue, one that we've tried to address and that will continue in the coming years. First, I want to specify something. Actually, a significant portion of the Martinican population was actually really upset in the sense that, oh, this was disorder. Some people like order also. I mean, the non-cool reactions to the event and the fact that some people were just like, including people who are like strong supporters of the mayor for the France, who had the impression that the mayor was just being humiliated, etc., were upset. Some of them from lower classes, some of them like from like very working background, and just thinking, who are these young people just coming like insult us in our city, in Fort-de-France? And that's part of the, I mean, so actually the array of reactions to the issue is actually really wide, and we might not be the majority to a certain extent. The second thing is that it's difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons, because the way what we talk about can often be, I mean, people can talk about the lack of legitimacy that we might have, delegitimize our saying, you're an intellectual. I mean, one that was coming back often was, oh, you intellectuals, you live far away from here, you're not from here, you cannot talk, but overall, you intellectuals, as if we being a scholar was kind of disconnecting you from knowing exactly the society in Martinique, from coming from very popular and blue-collar backgrounds in the case of Martinique. So it was not easy, but I think that it's a very progressive work. There is nothing that we can do to totally change this. And it means kind of ignoring part of what's going on social media, kind of ignoring part of this, and just like do like some deep work, just like advancing and doing stuff, organizing things in the public. It's been difficult because of the sanitary context, and we've been on a lockdown in Martinique as well. Actually, Daka and a group of other people, including myself, we created an organization, and Zaka is clearly a driving force behind the whole project, to just like have public arenas of discussion of all of this stuff, like some very intellectual stuff, like the carnival, chlordécone, all kind of things, and to do it all over the territory, and like invite people to just to talk and exchange and do, and we'll do that. We have good friends who are history teachers in high schools and secondary school who launched Oliron la Caraïbe, which is an online platform, like doing like small formats, video formats on the local history. And I think it's a multiplication of initiatives on parts of people who have been like kind of appalled by what was going on, that is going to do something. And I think that we have to recreate the spaces that have disappeared. We have to recreate them. And that's, at least that's the drive that we have right now to do that kind of things.
Yeah, and I would add to this that having a critical outlook on the issues and taking an analytical view is essential to the movement actually being understood, and it is not attempts at explicating the movement and explicating its actions are not attempts at undermining it, but rather at taking stock of the significance of those actions. And as scholars, whether or not we agree with any particular action is really not the point necessarily, but it is, as scholar and as citizens and as people from Martinique, I think it is essential that we really think about in a rigorous way the stakes and the issues and the consequences of those actions as a community also, because it is shaping us for the way forward. And we want to do it in a thoughtful way, and we want to do it in a way that makes us agent of that set of events, rather than just people reacting to outside forces, perhaps, or people reacting to events. For me, it is really what is at the heart of the intellectual challenge. And taking a step back is not Stockholm syndrome. It's not talking the language of some oppressor. Is bringing people in front of their responsibilities with regard to the political significance of what they're doing, with regard to the historical significance of what they're doing, and also appreciate and underline and shed light on what is happening also.
I was raised with a very simple, and I think this is the sentence, you find it in pretty much all of the emancipation movements. Knowledge is power. If you want to know what you want to achieve, if you want to actually achieve something, you need to know what you want to achieve. You need to understand how to get there. You need to understand the means to get there. You need to know what works and what doesn't, and you need to know what was achieved before you and what you need to do after that. I mean, that's very simple. It's not Stockholm syndrome. It's just, knowing where you want to go and trying to find out where you want to go. And for that, you need to build your maps. You need to have your tools, and those tools are not always physical tools. That's very simple on my side.
Thank you. We have another question. Jones, who is also thanking us for this rich discussion and asking, I wonder if the panelists could talk about the relationship of the struggle over historical memory and social justice activism in Martinique with similar discourses or activism in Guadeloupe. Having visited both places, she says, I was struck by the similarities and differences and the role that the new Museum of History and Culture in Pointe-à-Pitre plays in the conversation. Pointe-à-Pitre is the capital of Guadeloupe.
maybe just a few words. There's a very interesting book on social movements and the role of trade unions in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and the common point, but also the differences and the level of integration of trade unions, cultural movements in Martinique, while the work of representing workers, while still, I mean, is being taken on by trade unions in Martinique as well, but it's been also taken on largely by political parties, and especially the PPM. And in Guadeloupe, you have like this sort of like super integrated movement that is a movement of defense of workers, but is also a movement of a cultural movement. When they go to court to defend workers, they speak Creole, because in Martinique in Guadeloupe you speak Creole. You have like a whole very integrated work that's been done, which means that the sites of political socialization are not exactly the same. It was not cultural or in the open. It was also within organizations that are still pretty powerful in Guadeloupe. That's something that we saw in 2009. The book I'm referring to is a book by Pierre Audin on the LKP movement, ODIN, and the K5F movement in Martinique as well. But you really see that the political education of a number of people in Martinique on memory issues at the same level than on workers' rights is actually within organizations that are very integrated, which is not exactly the structure that we have in Martinique. That's part of the answer, because I'm not a specialist of Guadeloupe. I've been very interested in the fact I was invited once in a festival in Guadeloupe for the commemoration of the insurrection of slaves in Guadeloupe and the abolition of slavery in Guadeloupe. And actually the 3 or 4 days of commemorations were also the occasion to talk about the lack of hospital in Guadeloupe, about workers' rights, so there was like this sort of very memory moment. But then there was Kazé, who's a hip hop singer of Martinican origin, who was invited to Guadeloupe to think so it's like, come back to Guadeloupe and come and have this show in front of the audience that is also your audience. You had workers from the hospital, so it was a sort of very integrated also moment during which people discussed about memory and about some very contemporary and hot topics. And I just feel that this sort of spaces did not exist as such now in Martinique, but I might be wrong. I don't know what Zaka thinks about it.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Well, it's very. What's interesting about comparing like different communities in the diaspora in general is to see how it ebbs and flows. You know, sometimes you have a community who's very much like avant-garde in its structures, discourses, how they localize or how they think about things, and then it just kind of crumbles, and then it transmits somewhere else, and then maybe sometimes it comes back after, and that's very interesting to understand. As for the history, I think the paradox between Martinique and Guadeloupe is that they both have this very strong trade union tradition. And in Guadeloupe, the emancipation fight stayed mostly within those trade unions, and then into a more military or more violent movements that have today disappeared mostly. That disappeared actually. While in Martinique, they transform into localized political parties with different visions in terms of policy or end goals. Like you have like those layers like. PPM, for example, was kind of independentist, but then became an autonomist party. Then the generation of the 70s became independentist. Then within the independentist movements, there was different schools. The Marxist and the Trotskyist and they all had the parties, but actually they were not from the independence. So you have this very complicated left. Then of course, most of those parties that was kind of pro-emancipation were coming from the left wing. And the scope in Martinique is basically pro-assimilation party toward total independence. But today in 2020, and that's something that's very interesting when we think about what happened this year, for, I think, since the early 90s, there was 2 political parties that have been in power in Martinique, mostly. There is almost no pro-assimilation forces. Even right-wing parties in Martinique are for some form of autonomy, or now are even like saying they're Martinican. And in the last 20 years, the 2 parties that were in power has been mostly PPM, so the party from Aimé Césaire, the Progressist Party of Martinique, which is autonomist, but autonomist toward the angle of being independent in some form, and the independentist parties. Right now in Martinique, the head of the regional council of the autonomous council of Martinique is one of the founders of the independentist movement of Martinique. So you have this paradox. Right now, the political spectrum in its majority is pro towards some form of autonomy or independence, which means people are mostly conscious about the current situation, about the ideological debates, and about our relationship with France and our history with France. Creole was illegal almost to talk in Creole in the 80s. Now there's programs and there's schools and there's radio programs and everything. Things have changed. But then at the same time, there is this deep feeling of something that is not present. And this is the space that I live in and that we work in.
Thank you. We have another question from Ariela Gross. That is, she says, I'm wondering if you could speak to the interplay between the memory politics happening in Martinique, the Hexagone. What she means by that, I think, is European France, both at the level of the French government as well as Black Lives Matter on the streets in Paris. How much interaction is there between the movements?
Well, thank you so much, Ariela, for your question. It's a complex one, actually. But, well, what's interesting is that you clearly have local dynamics of memory regarding the memory of slavery in Martinique and the more national dynamics. We have, if you look at the commemoration of the centennial of the abolition of slavery, you clearly had a strong reluctance on part of France, people pushing, including communist people pushing for the commemoration in 1948. We have local commemorations of and days that are off, during which, people, I don't know, jour férié, how do you say that? Bank day? Holiday? It's not holiday, or whatever. But it's, you have those days in Martinique, May 22nd, in Guadeloupe, May 27th, etc. So there are some local dynamics regarding all of this. And you have the national dynamics that have in mainland hexagonal France that have accelerated since the end of the 1990s, plus the voting of the Taubira law at the beginning of the years 2000. And so you have like this sort of a catching up on part of the national arena, public arena. You had like the voting of this law in 2006 or 2007, the National Day for Commemoration, that really people don't care about when they're in Martinique and in Guadeloupe. May 10th is a date that is getting more important in mainland France, and that's important, but that is not clearly the focus of people in Martinique and Guadeloupe. They know that it's a day, but it's not the day that's really acknowledged. The day that's very acknowledged, that's important, is May 22nd for Martinique, etc. But then there is an articulation on a number of levels. There's an articulation because ever since there have been the Comité National pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, and now there's the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, people, including local historians from Martinique, have been part of the commissions, have been part of the discussion. So there is some, maybe not enough, but there's a form of incorporation of people in the Martinique and Guadeloupe, the Réunion Island, French Guiana, and the national level. Now, in terms of the interaction between the Black Lives Matter, the anti-racist movement in Paris, and how there was a sort of like sort of a Black Lives Matter movement in France as well. It was actually at the exact same time that there was all of these movements regarding the chlordécone and the toppling of the statues in Martinique. So even though people looked at them and connected them in terms of the ideas, and there was something, and it also brought legitimacy to what was going on in Martinique, it seems to me that there was a disconnect between the use, including the Black use of French Caribbean descent that was in the streets of Paris, and what was going on in Martinique and Guadeloupe. And in Paris, it seems to me that the connection with the memory of slavery was not direct. There was really the thing of like police violence and racism, addressing racism in a very straightforward way. And that even though the memory of slavery is part of the discussion and the conversation, it was not directly the thing. But I think that we would need to talk about it like very extensively.
Thank you. I don't know, Zaka, if you have a...
I don't really have anything to add.
Okay. Let me turn to another question that I think is an important. Kayama Glover, excuse me if I mispronounce the name. Given the remarkable fact that this conversation is happening in English at Yale among 3 Francophone thinkers, I guess our accents give us away. I wonder whether you all might reflect on the intermediary or mediating space of the United States when it comes to academic and or activist work in the Hexagon and in Martinique. And I can start just with a word as the person organizing this forum, indeed in English and indeed at Yale. And my thinking was that the set of events happening in Martinique and the debate going on around it that has been quite robust in the last few months, and we've talked about it a lot, we've heard about it a lot, was of such a relevance way beyond the confines of Martinique, that the broader world has much to learn from the ways in which this particular section of the diaspora is functioning right now within this particular climate that is declining itself globally and also hemispherically in the Americas. And so I thought it was very relevant and maybe in a bit of Martinican hubris that everybody should know about what's happening in Martinique, because it gives much food for thought. So I don't mean by it a gesture of appropriation of the debate for Martinique, but on the opposite, to shed light, to bring a spotlight on something very interesting and I think important going on there. There is also the level of the fact that I am based in the US, and it is true that the diaspora from Martinique is extending way beyond European France to many corners of the world, and this is a debate that is reaching these corners because of it. But the fact about displacement is also part of the situation that is coming to such a boiling point in this moment.
I mean, the way I see Kayama's question and comments is actually, we have to go through US spaces to actually discuss this. Is the very formal and I mean, setting. It's like, it's a third talk I'm giving in US universities by people who are interested, and sometimes, I mean, and in France, apart from the Fondation pour la mémoire de l'esclavage, most people accept, and that's again something very interesting, in Anglo-American departments. And actually, my faculty position is in an Anglo-American department. Apart from that, it's true that the interest is, people are kind of interested, but it's, the fact that we have to, I mean, in that case, there was clearly this everything that you said today is totally true. And at the same time, the lack of spaces in the French case to address this question is just like so great. I don't even know the adjective in English that I can use to say that. It was really interesting because last year I attended an event organized by Kayama Glover at Barnard on the digital Caribbean, and I was like, I wanted to cry because then you had like this room full of Caribbean scholars or scholars of the Caribbean gathering, explaining how the digital had been important as a space to address a number of issues that didn't have enough space in academia. And I was like, they don't realize how much space they have compared to what we have in mainland France. And it was a difficult moment because even though I feel really Martinique, and I've been here for 22 years, you know, and this kind of space that we're struggling to create are sometimes given to us in a much easier fashion through US universities, and that's a reality. And it's not going to get better given the current context in France regarding this kind of studies that have just started to rise, and that already you already have like forces that want to correct them. So well, thank you so much for the question, and Cécile for the space to actually address all of this.
Yeah, it's an incredible paradox, and I know it like very personally. It's been so I was living in Taiwan for 10 years almost. And I came back in Martinique. So of course, I left for my study, then I went to work, and then I went very far away. And I came back 4 years ago. And right away, my idea was to create a space and bring together writers and creators and you know, fiction, nonfiction, and so I created a review. And I, of course, decided to make it online because it would be easier to reach out to the diaspora, welcome to the 21st century, etc. This was so difficult. It's like, there was, of course, there was people who were willing to give me a space and say, hey, there's this guy who's trying to do a cultural and ID review in Martinique, and, you know, push the envelope, reveal new writers. But there was an overwhelming majority of people 4 years ago who explained to me that it made no sense, there was no need for it. And that was in the local side. But I pushed on through. And then it turned out like some of the things that were coming out from the review came even before some of the events that have been happening, like politically, whether here or in France, actually sometimes. And for example, the analysis about like the different statues, I wrote it in 2017, and so somehow the review and the project and the idea that we need spaces to talk about, we need to produce knowledge, we need to produce fiction, we need to integrate all those different narratives, and we need to talk about how we relate to the Caribbean, how all of the things are connected, Africa, North America, France, and we need to produce ourselves. Those spaces only make sense kind of now, but locally, like it was. I received no help, no funding, no public funding. I went and see all the institutions. I told them we should do events, we should do this, we should do that. I basically had to fund them myself. Like I couldn't find any help from local authorities, local institutions that have resources that are headed by Martinicans, and they did not see the need for those spaces of debates. And it's this year, in the last few months, that suddenly like there's this urgency to realize it. So that begs the question of, once you achieve some form of emancipation, some form of autonomy, it doesn't end there, and you need to think about what is structural, what is actually very important for societies to progress and advance and keep on pushing and keep on existing and getting stronger and getting more vibrant. And that also involves, you know, having your own institutions of cultures. And that's what they call soft power. It's a very, you know, real thing in diplomacy, in political relationships between countries. the United States have mastered them, and we are sadly small big players, and maybe one day we will realize how important it is.
Well, thank you so much. And incredibly, we are out of time for this webinar. I want to thank our audience for the many excellent, thought-provoking and courageous questions that came through the question and answers tool. We will make sure to send them to the panelists after the event, and so that they are made aware of what you guys shared with us. But let me just thank you for coming and listening on. Thank you to Audrey and Zaka for playing with us at Yale and Rhythm for this conversation. And thank you to Matthew Tanico and Rhythm and Professor Petey for kind of lending us this forum. I'm also happy to say that the session has been recorded, and we hope to be able to share it on the Rhythm YouTube channel soon. So we will make sure to let you know who has registered about where to go and find us to relive this moment together and share it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. I took a quick look at the various questions. It was great and lots of food for thought. Thank you so much, Cécile and Zaka.
Thank you.
Thank you.